Yeah, thankfully. Thanks. We ran out of wood the other week, so that was unfortunate. But welcome in. This is Carter Cabin. And Carter Cabin, if you're familiar with the area or anything like that, we like to say it's the oldest standing building in Scott County. I'm sure that's been tested over the years. But originally, so it was originally said to be a part of Carter's Fort. Excuse me. So Carter's Fort was built in around the 1770s, 1780s in that time period, and it was about 10 miles-ish from here. So around near kind of Ryco in that area, general area. We actually have two historical markers that say this is where Carter's Fort was. So which one is true? Your guess is as good as mine. So it's in that general area though. It has been long gone, of course, but this building originally is said to become from there. Now, originally, that land where Carter's Fort stood was originally Isaac Crisman's fort. So Isaac Crisman was the first person in this area to actually own a land deed. And he was the first one to actually say, like, own a piece of paper that says, this is my land. Unfortunately for him and his family, a few years after they got here, they were unfortunately killed. They were murdered. Sad for them. But a few years later, Thomas Carter and his two brothers, Thomas Carter and Mosby, not Mosby, that's his son. I get all the names confused, so I'm trying to work, bear with me when I get these names sorted out. But Thomas Carter and his two brothers, Norris and Judith, excuse me, were the ones who originally built Carter's Fort. So Carter's Fort was built in around the 1780s, 1770s, and 80s in that time period. And they lived there for a while. They kind of came back and forth. And it was said, like I said, that these logs were originally a part of that fort. Now, this building itself was not originally in this location. We actually moved it from a place called Carter's Town, which is a few miles from Carter's Fort. There's a lot of different Carter's names in front of things, but originally in Carter's Town, this was built by Mosby Carter and his descendants lived in here. This was how it stood in Carter's Town. So we actually took it apart piece by piece, labeled everything, brought it here by train, and built it up like Lincoln logs. Basically, we added the roof and the floor. That's not original, but the logs themselves are original. The fireplace is original. Of course, rebuilt to make it stable and safe. Other than that, logs are original. So one thing that some historians will like to say is that these logs, this cabin never saw the light of day at Carter's Fort. And they say that because if you look on the outside, it's a little bit easier to see on the outside. The notches, the joints, if you will, of the outside are dovetail notches. And dovetail notches didn't really come into play, didn't become popular in cabin building until kind of the 1800s, so a little bit later than when Carter's Fort was around. Now back then though, you gotta think about it, these logs, even today, are substantial. We don't have logs this size today, right, to build these kinds of log cabins. So back then, they wouldn't have just let them go to waste. So if Mosby Carter, once he grew up and moved on and built his own home, he would have most likely reused parts and pieces from his father's home, things that they weren't using anymore, to build his home. And the reason why I say that, and kind of some merit to go towards that, is if you look at these two logs up top, there's two logs at the top right here. You've got 3 notches on each side. And they're mirror images of each other. And they wouldn't have had notches for no reason. And like I said, we built this from the ground up, same as it was in Carter's Town. If you look on this side, there are no notches. So it begs the question, why are there notches in those logs if they didn't have something kind of a purpose? And originally in the 1700s, pretty much every single log cabin that you came upon out here would have lofts. So you would have a sleeping loft, you'd be upstairs, you'd have most likely strangers coming in and out, traveling through, staying below you as well. So originally you'd have a loft. So you think about it, logistically, one of these logs, like I said, they're mirror images of each other. So one of these you can imagine being on the opposite side of a room, having those joists go through and having the loft on top. So that just kind of gives merit to that idea that these logs were originally used in older buildings than this particular one that was lived in up until the 1990s, which I also think is a pretty fun fact. That this original building, it was added onto. So the Carter family, as they grew and they kind of moved on, they added onto this building. They added, kitchen, modern amenities, stuff like that, and was actually lived in up until the 1990s, until we acquired it. And I've had many people come in and out of here over the years of lightings and things that said that they know someone, they have a family friend or something who their home is the same bones pretty much as this log cabin. So these logs that had originally been felled in the 1770s are still being lived in today and used in homes today because it's just how they were built, and you wouldn't know it because you have siding on the outside. You would put, drywall on the inside, stuff like that. So I just think that's kind of a pretty fascinating aspect of these logs and how well they've stood the test of time. We also do believe, just speaking of the logs themselves, we believe they are wormy chestnut or American chestnut. So if you're familiar with American chestnut, you know that the chestnut blight really knocked them out. We'll have them here and there, but they only grow to the size of the ceiling. They're not very big. They're not going to produce any fruit. So it's significant to think about. At one point in time, especially kind of in this corner, kind of point over here, these logs are massive. And you can imagine the size of a tree that must have came from. Honestly, the size of this circle that we have right here would be the size of a tree almost, which is, to us over in the East Coast especially, it's really hard to fathom because we don't have that anymore. Obviously, we've logged it to almost not to oblivion, but you get. But yeah, and like I said, the ceiling and the floors are not original. The concrete that's in between the logs would have originally been chinking, so it would have been a mixture of clay, straw, manure, and that would have been kind of the insulation between the logs. And at the time of Carter's Fort and a little bit before then, you wouldn't have these big windows either. You would have small windows, if any windows at all. With Carter's Fort and kind of the fortifications of the time, you would have gun ports. So instead of windows, you'd have gun ports, and they would usually be just holes left in the chinking. So you'd have a little kind of section of the square that's left in the chinking of between the logs, so you could have that space to look out and protect yourself. Because you got to think back then, it was all about protection, all about survival for the forts in the 1700s in that time period. But yeah, that's pretty much the spiel. Again, I think the most significant thing about this place is the logs, and it's cliche, but if walls could talk, you can imagine what these would say. They've seen revolution, they've seen conflict and the building of a country, things like that. So it's quite unassuming on the outside, but once you kind of think about it, and I still can't imagine having trees that size to use for. I think about log cabins these days, they're not this big, but that's just a practicality point. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
I might have missed it. How many members of the family lived in here?
Oh, I didn't tell you that. So it was mostly Carter, and he had, I always mix this number up. It was him and his wife, and he had either 4 or 6 children. This was the original one-room cabin. At one point in time, when it did stood, it was also a way station of sorts, so people were in and out of here all the time, kind of as that way station along the roads that we're going through this area. Yeah.
How did it look like before it was moved here?
So it didn't look like this at all, really. It had rooms added on to each side of it. So this was the original one-room cabin, and they had siding on the side, you would have drywall inside, and they had other rooms. So it was actually a lot bigger than what we're standing in today. But this was originally, this is the original cabin that we had. So it was a little bit different than today for a long time, so up until the 1990s.